Hello, and welcome to this episode of In Discussion With from Medical Update Online. Today I'm talking to Cindy Williams about the launch of a hospital pharmacy drone delivery service for underserved communities. Could you start by introducing yourself?
I'm Cindy Williams. I'm the Vice President and Chief Pharmacy Officer for Riverside Health, located in southeastern Virginia.
And can you give us a brief overview of your current role, what it involves?
In my current role, I'm responsible for pharmacy operations across our continuum of care. And for Riverside, that includes hospitals, physician offices, and long-term care facilities, including nursing homes, assisted living, and that type of thing. We also have some home-based services, including home health and hospice.
Now, I understand that you have set up a scheme for delivering medicines by drone, and this is what I would like us to talk about today. But first, a bit of background. Could you tell us a bit about Riverside Health, where it is, what kind of population does it serve? Is it just one hospital, and what specialties does it cover?
So for Riverside Health, we've actually been a hospital for over 100 years. We developed into a health system within the last 30 or so years. We have four hospitals. We have a mental health facility in addition to the four hospitals. We have approximately 800 physicians or mid-level providers across roughly 100 locations of care. And those providers include primary care services as well as specialists. We have infusion suites, we have nursing homes, and we have some home-based services. As far as our geography, we're located in the mid-Atlantic section of the United States in Virginia. We are down towards the coast, and our population goes from urban, medically underserved, more inner city urban, to suburban, and all the way to very rural, with our most rural hospital being located on the Virginia Eastern Shore, which is not connected to the Virginia mainland, except by a 23-mile bridge tunnel. Part of the service offerings that we provide from that location on the Eastern Shore, where we have a hospital and a number of medical practices, is we actually have a primary care location located on an island in the middle of the Chesapeake Bay. And so, as you can imagine, it's a roughly 17 miles from the closest point on the mainland. As you can imagine, it's very challenging to provide care for those individuals who tend to be lower income and medically underserved.
And what drew you to the idea of using drones? Was medicines delivery a problem in some way?
We first started evaluating drone technology really focused on our population on the Eastern Shore of Virginia. One of the challenges that we have specifically in that region is a real lack of public transportation. There is no public transportation option on the Eastern Shore other than a limited van service that simply goes up the main highway that goes from north to south. But if you live in one of the communities that are on either of the coast, there's really no public transportation option, even for those that are medically in need, such as, they don't drive, they have mobility issue, there's just not medical services. The other thing that we know on the Virginia Eastern Shore is that community has a long history of being medically underserved, whether that be lack of insurance, whether that be lack of healthcare providers. And so as we looked at our most vulnerable being Tangier Island, where we have the clinic, we understood that individuals having access to basic healthcare, including their prescription medications, was a need. We also know in that community that we have a higher incidence of certain chronic illnesses, specifically hypertension, congestive heart failure, and respiratory disorders such as COPD and asthma. So when there was an opportunity to partner at the state level initially, the state of Virginia had some limited grant funding for a technology pilot. And so we joined some of our community members and we applied for that and we were awarded. And then subsequently, we were awarded a much larger grant from the US government that allowed us to take the pilot forward and actually perform a limited amount of drone delivery of medications to our patients.
That's interesting. Can we go a little deeper into the funding? Did the hospital have spare money for this kind of project?
Yeah, this was completely funded to this point by either state or federal grants. The initial grant was very small from the state of Virginia and allowed us to really start discussing proof of concept. That's about as far as we got with that particular grant. For the grant process, we did partner with others in the community in order to be successful. So our partners included the local governments, because the grant funding comes through the local government. So we partnered with the 2 counties that are represented on the Virginia Eastern Shore. We partnered with a drone vendor because we do not own drones, nor do we have the expertise to operate drones. So we partnered with a company called Drone Up, which is one of the drone vendors in the United States, as our drone and technology experts. And then we partnered with a research group at one of the local universities, Old Dominion University. And interestingly enough, both of the gentlemen that we're working with on this grant through an Old Dominion Innovation Center had their backgrounds, their careers were with NASA. So they were very knowledgeable, not only about flight, but also around federal funding and leveraging federal funding, as well as project management. And so that became the 4 parties that were involved in the grant process. After we received the state grant, that gave us some momentum to say, we believe there is a concept here, but we will need greater funding as well as support to understand all the nuances around drones, drone regulations, and all of those things. And so under the Biden administration, as part of their infrastructure funding, they developed a platform for innovative technology grants, interestingly enough, under the Department of Transportation. So not everything under these grants was drone focused. I believe in phase 1 funding, which we were able to secure, I believe there were approximately 35 to 40 grants in that, and about 8 of them were drone related. But even with the ones that were drone related across the country, there was only one other that was healthcare focused. And so somewhat of a minority in the type of work we were doing with drones as part of that grant process. And it was a 2.5 or just over 2 year, almost 2.5 year demonstration grant for phase 1. And there will be subsequent grant opportunities under phase 2 in the future.
What exactly is delivered? Is it medication supplies or is it dispensed medicines for patients?
With the initial phase of our grant, our premise when we went in was about using drone delivery to reach vulnerable populations to improve their health outcomes. So that was really the premise of the grant with the Department of Transportation. So in that, we needed to first understand what medications would the FAA allow us to deliver by drones. And so in collaboration with our drone partner, we had discussions with the FAA around somewhat the guardrails we needed to work within. So for example, they really did not want us to look at delivering medications that are aerosolized, for example, because they weren't quite sure what the pressure gradients would do with, say, an inhaler that has an aerosolized canister. They really did not want us to deliver any medication that would be considered a hazardous substance. In the US, there are, from the EPA, different medications that are considered hazardous if you handle them, for example, oral chemotherapy items, for example. And so they somewhat gave us some guardrails. Our next stop was to go to the Board of Pharmacy because in the United States, we're governed in the practice of pharmacy by the federal government through the FDA and the Food and Drug Administration and the Drug Enforcement Agency. But at the state level, we're governed by a state board of pharmacy. And so we had a conversation with the state board of pharmacy to let them know what we were doing, to see what their concerns may be. And they did not want us to deliver any medications that may either have temperature excursion challenges. So you think about insulins and things like this, at least in the first phase. They also did not want us to deliver what we would consider to be drug DEA controlled medications that might have the potential for diversion and abuse. So that became the framework for us to say, okay, if we look at our chronic conditions where we perform worse than the state or national average on the Eastern Shore, what would those be? And the ones that would come to the top would either be cardiac conditions or our COPD asthmatics. But since the COPD patients often use inhalers, that came off of the table. And we said, if we want to really be able to measure outcomes, and we know that's not going to happen in a year, but if we want to be able to measure outcomes, then hypertension becomes the easiest because blood pressure is a very, very specific monitor that we can manage over periods of time. So that became the patient population that we wanted to target for the medication delivery. So to answer your question, at least for the premise of the grant, we are delivering filled prescriptions from our retail pharmacy for hypertension. So whether that's, their, ACE inhibitors, whether it's the diuretics, whether it's beta blockers, whatever that may be that the patient's taking for their hypertension, those would be the medications that we had an initial focus on.
Oh, you mentioned products that the Drug Enforcement Agency might be concerned about. Would those be narcotics, opioids, that sort of thing?
Yes, the Drug Enforcement Agency controls. They've got a scheduling scheme in the United States from Schedule 2 to Schedule 5, and 2 being the most likely for abuse and diversion, which would be primarily opioids, stimulants such as our ADHD drugs, and then they tend to go into lesser. Schedule 3 would include your benzodiazepines. So they were really interested in, primarily your stimulants, your opioids, your benzodiazepines, and those types of things. They really, because as we talk about delivery, and it's a little different than the patient or a patient's family member. In the United States, when you go to pick up those medications at your pharmacy, you have to show a picture ID, right? So that's one of the requirements that we have to meet within our retail pharmacies. And so obviously, if you're delivering via drone, that ability to do that and get that signature and whatnot is not there. And so the Board of Pharmacy said, just from a potential diversion risk, we would really not want to see you do those Drug Enforcement Agency scheduled drugs for delivery.
So you are delivering filled prescription items. So are they being delivered directly to patients at their homes, or are they delivered to a pharmacy or clinic so that patients can collect them?
For our particular pilot, at least in phase 1 of the pilot, all of the deliveries were going from the hospital, which was considered the drone port for the purpose of this pilot, to an individual patient's home. Now, within that process, because of either FAA regulations, flight regulations, or drone capabilities, we had to look only at patients initially within a 2-mile radius of a hospital. So that is an FAA regulation, and it's called visual line of sight. So for our initial pilot, before we could apply for a waiver for a longer flight pattern from the FAA, we had to do things within 2 miles. In addition to that, once we identified potential patients with uncontrolled hypertension that were patients of our health system, our drone partner then mapped all the addresses, and they did geomapping analysis to say, are there any potential barriers to drone delivery because of power lines, because of tree canopy, and those types of things? So we had to then further narrow down the scope of the patients based on the drone capabilities. They wanted to make sure, especially for this initial pilot, that we go into it in a very successful manner. And so that then further limited the number of patients. Initial phase of the pilot was delivering filled prescriptions for antihypertensives to patients' homes from our hospital. Now, as we started talking about Tangier Island, which has been more in the latter phases and will be expanded upon if we're able to get phase 2 grant funding, that pilot looks a little bit different in that it would not be financially viable to fly a drone 17 miles over the water to deliver prescriptions to a single patient. So in that situation, our process is to fly the drone from the hospital drone port to our medical practice there, because we do have a family practice location where they can retrieve the medications from the drone, and the patients that they serve come to that clinic anyway, so they would pick up the prescriptions at the clinic. And so a little bit of a different model when we start looking at the island, because it's not really, it's one thing if you're delivering to one single patient that's 3 miles away, where that drone can get to that patient, drop the prescription, and come back within a matter of minutes, versus a specialized drone, which is what we needed to be able to get over 17 miles because of battery life. We had to use 2 different drone models, more like a small airplane that literally needs to land, have somebody remove the cargo, and then a button needs to be pushed to have it take back off. So in that model with the island, it is going to our medical practice, and then they further distribute the medications to the patients.
What weights can be carried by these 2 different types of drone that you have? And could you just clarify the ranges that they have, how far they can fly?
The initial drone that we used for our work within the 2-mile radius is a drone that has the capacity to fly approximately 20 miles, but that for the battery life. So it's really the battery life. And you probably never want to go to the full 20 miles. And so we felt comfortable that if we needed to go at 5 miles or 7 miles, because you have to remember, they have to return and they have to hover. And so they're using, in order to drop the package, there is some minimal hover time while they are, they come down to the altitude that they need to have the wire to drop the package onto the ground in a controlled manner at the patient's home. And so that particular drone, which could carry about 3 pounds, which is, sort of more than you think, actually, with prescription medications, that drone can go up to 20 miles. But most of the testing we did was within about a 5-mile radius. So that would have been 10 miles round trip plus the hover time, because you never want the drone, obviously, to have a battery fail on the way back. The other thing we learned, though, is, you think about how much weight can you put in there, but prescription medications don't weigh a lot, right? If you've only got a couple of bottles of antihypertensives for even a 90-day supply. So with our initial flights, which we only did to a couple of patients, the proof of concept that, sort of crawl before you walk. We actually did not have enough weight, and the drone wire could not disengage the package. So we had to bring it back to the hospital, and we simply put a bottle of water, just one of the, 17-ounce bottles of water, just to give it enough weight so there's a sweet spot that you have to find in order for the drone to be optimized. So that was the original drone that we used, and that's more the traditional drone that many people think about that have the multiple, propellers. But in order to get across 17 miles of water and back, it takes a different type of drone. And so our drone partner did a tremendous amount of research and eventually settled on a drone manufactured in Australia as the drone that they selected for the work over water. That particular drone is more like a small plane. It has a cargo capacity of about 5 pounds. It doesn't have the same limitations as far as a specific weight to make the guide wire drop, because in that particular drone, it actually lands and personnel need to remove the cargo and then push a button to send the drone back to the drone port. So that required a different technology. And interestingly enough, the first time that our drone partner had used that technology, so the amount of testing that was required prior to actually putting it into production was fairly extensive, and had to be signed off by the FAA before we could do our initial flight to the island.
You've mentioned the guide wire a couple of times, and I'm curious, how is the delivery made? Does the drone just drop the goods somewhere nearby?
So the drone takes off from the hospital, from the drone port, and it goes up to about 300 feet above ground. It will then travel to its destination, which is put in using GPS coordinates, which is the patient's home in this case. And once it gets to that destination, it will drop in altitude to roughly 80 feet above ground. So 300 feet or roughly 100 meters down to probably, if I'm doing my math, roughly 25 meters above ground. Once it gets to that height, that lower height at the residence, it drops the package by a guide wire that drops from the bottom of the drone very slowly in a controlled manner. That guide wire then, once the package hits the ground, and there's specially designed boxes that we put the medications in. The way that the box is designed, once the package hits the ground, there's enough slack in the line that the hook becomes unengaged from the top of the box, and the guide wire then goes back up into the drone. The drone then goes back up to 300 feet or 100 meters and comes back to the drone port. But it's a very controlled process where once it gets to its delivery location, it hovers in a stationary manner, drops to the right altitude, and then the guide wire is what actually drops down with the package attached and until it hits the ground. And then the guide wire is retracted and the drone comes back home.
So, as a patient, I would see the drone arrive in my driveway.
Yes,
Wow.
yes. And that's one of the reasons that as we were looking at locations, they had to be very careful. If it was a heavily treed lot, there may not be a clear landing zone. And so, at least for our proof of concept, again, you want to go into it being the most conservative and with the idea that you'll be the most successful that you can. And so, we look to our drone partner based on their experience doing drone delivery for other commercial entities in other parts of the country, that they understand what makes a successful drop. One of the other things we did not have to face, but I've talked to some individuals doing drone projects in more urban areas, is if you think about apartment buildings, and that provides a different kind of complexity around finding the right landing zone. So, for example, do they have a courtyard? Can they come into the courtyard? What does that look like? But for our purposes, because we're very rural, most, the individuals we were delivering to lived in single family homes with a yard around them. And so the goal was to deliver those packages essentially to their front porch, or, the right at the bottom of the stairs to the front porch, if you will.
Now, what about security? How can you be sure the medicines or even the drone don't get stolen or damaged?
So, one of the things we did from the pilot is we coordinated very heavily with our patients that signed up to be in the pilot to understand when we were going to deliver, which day, and about which time, and are they going to be home. But at the end of the day, at least in the United States, Amazon delivers medications, FedEx delivers medications, UPS delivers medications, and those are just left on people's front steps with no security. So there's really models in existence in the United States where medications are delivered and there's nobody there to pick them up until later in the day. But again, we wanted to be very conservative. And so we did coordinate deliveries when the individual was going to be home for the purposes of the pilot. But that's technically not required. I think as a pharmacist, one of the other things, in addition to potential theft, and the boxes were not marked in a manner that you would understand that there are medications in them, right? They, very limited, basically a white box, from a patient privacy perspective. We have certain regulations in the United States that we have to follow around patient privacy under HIPAA, and which is the federal code. And so there was no distinguishing information on the outside of the package other than the physical address. So there's not any information about what's in the package. But I worry more, what about temperature excursions with medications? If you were delivering in the wintertime, right? Or is it going to be freezing? Medications aren't really meant to be stored at freezing conditions, right? They should be controlled room temperature. So, there are many factors that go into it. So for the purpose of the pilot, we required the person to be at home or a family member be at home, and we coordinated those deliveries such that they were aware approximately what time the delivery would show up.
What about Federal Aviation Authority regulations? Do they limit what you can do?
So the FAA heavily controls drones, as you can imagine. There have been some things in the press in the United States in the last month around, drones, and nobody knows whose drone they belong to. So, our drone partner, very knowledgeable around the FAA regulations. As part of this federal grant, we had a liaison at the FAA for us to have conversations with around what we were attempting to do, the guardrails within which we needed to operate, whether that was what medications we could carry, whether that was how far we could fly. For drones, there are different waivers that you can apply for that dictate how far you can fly a drone. It starts off as the more unrestricted, which is visual line of sight within 2 miles. And then the next stage is up to 5 miles. And then there's some that are beyond that. So the FAA heavily regulates what you can do. That being said, there's not a commercial airport on the Eastern Shore, and obviously commercial airline are flying much higher than we are. But as a hospital, we had to be very sensitive to helicopters that may be coming into our helipad to medically evacuate patients. And so we did have very tight communication with our emergency medical response personnel in the area. We let them know the dates and the times we would be flying. We had a process where if there was the need for a medical evacuation and we needed to pause the drone operations, we had tight communication around that. So that was part of the work we did related to the helicopter situation. It's not that common at that hospital that we have helicopters coming and going, but it does happen. The other thing in this rural area that we have to be concerned about was it's a very agricultural area. And as such, there are planes that do crop dusting and that type of thing. And so early on in the process, as we were developing our model, we engaged with the pilots at the local, on the local level, especially those that may have been voicing concerns around, low flying drones. Their planes fly low to do crop dusting, and how do we make sure that we understand their needs and they understand our needs? And so it was a little contentious to start, but I think once they understood what we were doing, that we were doing this in a pilot manner, that it would be very well orchestrated and planned and on very specific days, since again, it's a pilot, we were able to bridge that relationship and worked very collaboratively with them through the pilot.
This is a very interesting project. Where do you go from here? What economies of scale are going to be needed to make this work?
So the work isn't done yet. I think we've learned a number of things from the pilot, and we are coming up to the end of phase 1 funding, and we will be applying for phase 2 funding, as well as looking at other grants, because we're not to a point where this process is fine-tuned enough to be commercialized and be able to pay for it, because drones are very expensive. And it's really understanding and getting the waivers from the FAA and really building a model that has scale, because that's what will make it viable from a commercial perspective. And so where we've gotten to this point is we know that we can successfully deliver medications to patients within that 5-mile radius of our hospital. So that, we have proven that many times. We've delivered to the patients that enrolled in the pilot, over the last 18 months. We've had routine deliveries every 90 days to those individuals. So we know that we can do that. Now, with that being said, one thing everybody needs to understand about drones is they're very weather dependent. They cannot fly above, in certain windy conditions, for example. So it's not quite as straightforward as getting in a car and driving something somewhere. So that's why I think these proof of concepts are so important, to understand the parameters and when these drones can fly. Relative to the work we're doing on Tangier Island, that is not as well developed because there are still constraints with the waiver we have from the FAA on what we can carry. So the waiver to this point has not allowed us to carry patient-specific filled medications to the Eastern Shore. But what it has allowed us to do is deliver medical supplies, so stock medications that we use in our clinic. So we have delivered medications that we use in our clinic. And I think more importantly, because this was also part of our long-term goal, and we've successfully done this several times now, is bring back laboratory blood tubes from our clinic there to the hospital to be able to get same-day results. because one of the other barriers that we face on that island is the only way to get there is by plane or boat, ferry or boat or plane. We have a physician that flies out at least once a month, and traditionally he would bring back the lab samples. And so if you needed to get a diagnostic lab test, you got it done once a month because that's when the samples came back, which could be a barrier. You may need a lab sample sooner than once a month. The other, way that we get supplies and things out there and back is by the ferry. And there are certain times of the year the ferry either doesn't run, the ferry sometimes breaks down. It can be bad weather and the ferry doesn't go. So there's a lot of inconsistencies in how things come and go to Tangier. So the idea is the drone could actually expand beyond medication delivery and do other types of functions. The reason the FAA, based on our existing waiver, which is not a full waiver to go that 17 miles, it doesn't allow us to do anything that they would consider to be commercial trade. And they would consider delivering a filled prescription to a patient as commercial trade. And so us delivering supplies to our own clinic is not considered commercial trade because it's all owned by the same organization. But us delivering to a patient a filled prescription from the pharmacy, the FAA considers that commercial trade. So at this point, we've not been able to leverage that yet.
And my last question, has this project been worthwhile? And would you recommend that colleagues with a similar problem go down this route as well?
I think it's been worthwhile. One of the things that I learned during this, because when we started this process, there were a couple of pockets of individuals doing not the same work, but similar drone work across the country. There was a pilot out in Salt Lake City, so urban area. There was a pilot that was being done in Charlotte, North Carolina, so more urban area. But I think focusing in a rural area, we were really one of the first that I'm aware of that started doing some of that work. And I think there's great potential, especially in medically underserved rural areas. I think the challenges that we face in a rural area are very different than what an urban area may face. I think the other thing is having not only that seed money funding from the federal government was so critical in order to get us where we have gotten in such a small period of time. Because when I talk to some of my colleagues across the country that were perhaps doing this with more limited grant funding, we were able to do far more deliveries in a short period of time than they were able to do in several years, because we had the ability to bring together a really strong collaborative team to, I would say, fast start the process. I think there's been a lot of learning. I never thought I would have learned as much about FAA waivers as I have. But I think, understanding what some of the limitations are going to be and things we need to navigate and perhaps things we need to advocate for, right? Because, advocacy sometimes, just because a regulation's in place doesn't mean that you can't advocate to have it changed. So I think that advocacy, so I would definitely, we would like to get phase 2 funding to take this to the next level. And one of our goals going into this, and it's really one of the goals that the Department of Transportation had, was not only, for us to be able to impact our community, but to really develop a roadmap for others and share that forward so that others coming behind us could really get to our point even quicker, because they would understand a lot of whatever the challenges were, the regulations were, whatever, that we could really give others a blueprint. In fact, we're working with a collaborative in Maryland that got phase one funding about a year and a half after us. They just got phase one funding. It's a similar project. They're not that far distance from us, just one state up. And we're collaborating with them to get them further than we got in phase one by sharing all of our learning so that they could then start almost at the next step and take the learning further.
Cindy Williams, thank you very much for talking to us about this fascinating topic. That really has been terrifically interesting and inspiring. For more information about the work described in this interview, please visit our website using the links in the description, and be sure to subscribe for more news, videos, journals, and podcasts. For updates straight to your inbox, please follow the links below. And thanks for watching.